Hello. Welcome, everyone, to our very first daytime event we've hosted, and this is why. Small crowds when people are in classes. And the second to last event of the year for the Pluralism Initiative. I'm Liza Oliver, Director of the Pluralism Initiative and Associate Professor of Art History. And this afternoon, it is a pleasure to be able to introduce to you Yael Lempert and Ezzedine Fishere, both of whom have so many posts in the Foreign Service, it's too much to recount them all, so I'm going to summarize with some highlights. Ezzedine Fishere is a distinguished fellow at Dartmouth College, where he teaches in Middle Eastern Studies and Jewish Studies. Prior to Dartmouth, he was a professor of political science at the American University of Cairo and diplomat and ambassador in Egypt's Foreign Service. His roles included serving as the rapporteur in the Independent Commission on Restructuring the League of Arab States in 2011 to 13, counselor to the Egyptian Foreign Ministry with a focus on Arab-Israeli relations and regional security from 2005 to 7, and head of the political section of the Egyptian Embassy in Tel Aviv from 1998 to 2001. He also served as a diplomat with the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process in Jerusalem. In addition to his very successful career in the Foreign Service, Ezzedine is the author of 9 novels in Arabic, 2 of which have been nominated for the International Prize in Arabic Fiction, and several have also been published in English, including most recently Nightfall in Cairo, about the aftermath of the Tahrir Uprising and Egypt's failed revolution. Professor Fishere has also been spending a lot of time at Wellesley this year as he is the lead on the Pluralism Initiative's Fellows Seminar on Israel-Palestine, which will be holding its last session of the year this evening. Yael Lempert served as the United States Ambassador to Jordan from 2003 to 5. In the Foreign Service, she also served as the Assistant Secretary of State and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs from 2021 to 2023, not 2001, and as the Deputy Chief of Mission for from 2019 to 2020. She was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Egypt and North Africa from 2017 to 18. She's also served on the National Security Council staff of 3 presidents, including as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for the Levant, Israel, and Egypt from 2014 to 17. Prior to that, she was the Deputy Principal Officer at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem and worked from 2009 to 11 at the U.S. Embassy in Libya, where she spent more than half of her tour as the Acting Deputy Chief of Mission. From 2006 to 9, she served at the U.S. Embassy in Egypt, and which is where I suspect they came to know one another, no? And she is currently the Vice President of Outreach at the Middle East Institute in D.C. This afternoon, they will be in conversation on the topic, Israel and Palestine, a way forward. And that's with a question mark, not a period. So please join me in welcoming Ezzedine and Yael.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. What I have to say is that I now feel inadequate because I haven't written any novels. 9? Really?
That tells you how much time I was spending on diplomatic work. I understand that we'll be having another conversation about the way forward. We've been having some of those, especially recently since you left the Foreign Service. And I know that in your career you came across a lot of Arab journalists, and you know how Arab journalists, when they ask a question, they usually give an answer in the question or a mini lecture. And I want to honor this tradition. So I'm going to ask you a simple question with a long introduction. And the question is about the way forward, as the title suggests, is whether you see realistically a way forward, given, here's where the lecture comes in, given the grim realities we have on the ground. So while people are talking about two-state solution or any kind of form of solution, what Palestinians would call the solutionism, right? On the ground, we have a one-state reality that is extremely harsh and that has the Palestinians living with their not only self-determination denied, but also sometimes basic freedoms, freedom of movement, and so on. You have a situation in Gaza where other than the destruction and the death that we have seen today, the Gaza Strip is almost entirely dependent on humanitarian assistance with no economic productive activities to talk about, right? Almost everybody in Gaza has been displaced at least once, and so on and so forth. In West Bank, we have settlers' attacks, we have erosion of whatever has been achieved under Oslo in terms of basic autonomy for the Palestinians. So there seem to be less and less support for any form of self-determination for the Palestinians, not only among the Israeli public opinion, but more importantly, in the ruling coalition, in the political system in Israel. And that's, on the Palestinian side, the situation politically is not looking brighter. So given all this, what realistic way forward can we talk about?
That was a long introduction. First and foremost, it's a real pleasure to be here with a dear old friend and a colleague who I respect enormously. And it's a real pleasure to be here at Wellesley. And I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I told her, of course, I'm the very uncool mom with a 15-year-old. And I mentioned to her yesterday where I was coming, and I spoke to her a little bit about Wellesley and that it's a women's college. And she said, "Wow, that's tough," which apparently means it's really cool. So I got some very positive feedback, which is rare from my teens. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to have earned that. Look, I'm in full agreement with you about what a grim moment this is. And we've both worked on Israel and Palestine and trying to figure out a way forward for many, many years. Both of us, I think, have been real proponents for two states and living side by side in peace and security, and from our different respective professional perches, trying to urge a constructive and productive way forward. It's a dark moment. Does that mean that all hope is lost? And I've seen all the various pronouncements and read articles and books by friends on both the left and the right in the United States, arguing that two states is absolutely no longer possible. Each of them has reached that conclusion for different reasons, and I understand why they have. But is the vision of one state that some are putting forward either an extremely problematic and racist system, viewed from the extremes of both sides, or a more idyllic system based in equality? Sadly, I think is probably equally as unrealistic from this starting point as a two-state solution. And we can dive into that if you want to at any point. So I look at it from what is required, what are the basic fundamentals that need to be in place to reach a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace, security, dignity, freedom. You need an American administration that is willing to push and be effective and focused and balanced in their approach on this. You need an Israeli coalition and government that is willing to sit down for negotiations and make compromises, because there's obviously a huge asymmetry in the power dynamic, whereby we've been for the past several years in a situation where Israel is not interested in sitting down, and will cite a lot of reasons why they won't come to the negotiating table. And you need a Palestinian leadership that actually is representative and can sign something and bring along a population in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Aside from all of the various issues that you laid out vis-a-vis the West Bank and Gaza and the situation right now, and I think that we should definitely explore those at greater length. None of those three aspects exist right now. Does that mean that you throw in the towel and say, okay, we're going to consign ourselves to endless war? Or do you try and, we were talking about, my father was a physician, first stop the bleeding, right? What can we do to preserve right now, in this very grim moment, prospects for a better future for both peoples, when it will be, I certainly hope and pray that there will be a more propitious moment to move forward. I do think that most importantly, out of all of what I just cited, you have two peoples now, particularly young Israelis and young Palestinians, who increasingly do not believe that peace is possible. They do not believe that two states is possible. And I understand why they feel that is the case. And so reigniting a sense of possibility and the actual constructive efforts that you have to make to do so, I think is critical.
If I'm not mistaken, what I hear you say is pretty much close to what Antony Blinken was saying in his confirmation hearing.
I have not committed that to memory.
Where he was basically saying it is clear that there is no path today the conditions are not there for a two-state solution, but we have to at least preserve the possibility of achieving that and keep hope alive and lay the ground for this to become possible. My point is regardless of similarity differences, is things happen on the ground as time goes by. The situation doesn't stay the same, right?
Absolutely.
So while people who are interested in a solution of this type try to preserve the possibility, the political players who are not interested in a solution of this type make sure that things develop on the ground in order to block that path. Mm-hmm. And his experience shows that they have been much more successful. So my question is, if we don't have a clear way forward, positive way forward now, we have to be prepared to accept that the future is going to be more bleak and there will be more conflict and it will deteriorate almost for certain. And that's not a call to throw the towel or to just resign ourselves to it. It is just to be sober about that conflict and not kind of follow that illusion of a solution that never comes.
I absolutely agree. And I would say where I would differ from the statement by Tony Blinken that you cited is I think that preserving the prospects for a future two-state solution or a future equitable one-state, you need to be working now to preserve the prospects, not just saying you will preserve the prospects, not just reactive approaches, but some quite meaningful measures that would impact on the ground. And so what do I mean? I mean, let's talk about the West Bank. And one of the opportunity costs of this most recent conflict with Iran has been, I think, the lens of the world has shifted from Gaza and the humanitarian catastrophe and the challenges ahead there to Iran, understandably. But what we saw over the past 2 years with the conflict in Gaza is the same thing happening in terms of the West Bank, that there has not been a lot of attention to what has been happening on the West Bank. And what has been happening on the West Bank is deeply, deeply concerning because you see with this Israeli coalition a really accelerated effort at de facto annexation of the West Bank. And a settlement effort that is, I think, really unprecedented if you compare it to rates in the past of announcements, of legalization of settlements and outposts, of changes in the infrastructure legally of how the West Bank has been administered that are leading to foreclosing prospects for a Palestinian state there. And so when I say stop the bleeding, I mean when people in the United States or policymakers talk about a two-state solution, it can't be something that is aspirational and you two-state solution, period. You say two-state solution, comma, and so in order to preserve the prospects for it, we need to immediately engage with Israel in more meaningful ways on the settlement issue, because as you look at this conflict, that is a proximate issue that is foreclosing territorial possibility for a Palestinian state that is unified, it has a unitary landmass in the West Bank to then be connected to Gaza. And that is being done very, very intentionally and not behind any it's not being veiled by those in the Israeli coalition who, it was very interesting because President Trump was very clear last year, speaking, there will be no Israeli annexation of the West Bank. And you have Israeli ministers saying it's not the time now for legal annexation, but it is, in the term they're using, is practical annexation. And that is indeed what is practically happening. And so I would advocate for a more forceful American policy to engage with Israel so at least that can be forestalled. And there's a few kind of notorious settlements, E1 being one that was announced a few months ago. Every American administration for the past several decades, Republican and Democrat alike, it's a settlement area outside of Jerusalem that basically, if you move forward with it, bisects the West Bank, preventing a unitary future Palestinian state there. It's being done very, very intentionally. And that is why every American administration to date has engaged on that. So it's surprising to me that this administration, if the president does not believe that Israel should annex the West Bank, has not engaged more vigorously, for instance, on that particular settlement.
I don't want to make myself the kind of representative of the realistic world and you, the lofty, hopeful diplomat, because it's unfair and also.
I like to think I'm realistic also.
And also unhelpful, yes. So let's do this as if we're doing strategic planning, right? So we have, for this to move forward in a positive way, the way you describe it, whether it's a one state or two or three or whatever, for this to happen, you mentioned three things that we need.
At a minimum, I mean.
At a minimum. So we'll bracket the U.S. I'll circle back to the U.S. But then, what are the chances, or what are the pathways that we can see if we're trying to assess the likelihood of this happening? What are the pathways you can see of the emergence of a Palestinian representative body out of this meltdown that we see on the Palestinian side, and the emergence of a core Israeli constituency that understands that the future of Israel as a national home for Jews, that future is directly linked to Palestinian self-determination. Do you see pathways for those two developments to happen? Do you see things that outside parties can do? Because ultimately those are domestic issues. Mm-hmm. We can't engineer Israel, we can't engineer Palestine. But do you see a pathway? Do you see a role? How would this come about?
Again, because I don't want to be perceived as the lofty, hopeful diplomat, this is a very, very dark and grim moment. And it is with the deepest concern that we have this conversation, and I know it's a shared concern and worry about the future. Because if we can't cobble together some more positive and constructive thoughts about a way forward, then you're just consigned to this cycle of never-ending conflict to the detriment of both, the deep detriment and pain of both Palestinians and Israelis. And I think both have been through tremendous trauma in recent years and continue to undergo that. And when I think about Israel and the impact of October 7th on them, and not just the impact of October 7th, but I think you see the impact on both Israelis and Palestinians of decades now of separation. And not knowing each other except in a posture of conflict, which leads to dehumanization and a tremendous lack of empathy. And I think also leads to some really terrible thinking on both sides. And also, when you hear some of the rhetoric in Israel, it can be along the lines of, we've tried that, right? We tried that. We tried that with Gaza, and look what happened, right? We withdrew from Gaza. Hamas took over, and look what happened, which is a gross oversimplification.
Yes, but those are relevant political realities.
Yes, a political reality.
Yes.
I think that there was a strain of thinking in Israel, and still is, that there could be what's called the, quote, outside-in approach, right? Make peace with the Arab world. And the Abraham Accords were a part of that, obviously the most recent example. And then that will lead to pressure on the Palestinians, and there will be a resolution with the Palestinians, short of a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that strain of thinking has been proven incorrect by the past 2 years.
It has been proven incorrect by October 7 and the war that followed.
Yes.
But some would say that this model is resuscitated by the Gaza ceasefire, and that the Gaza ceasefire agreement and that model of outside in could be the practical way forward.
They will be advocating for it.
Yes, and the advocates of this view would tell you that this, number one, would help the outside support, the Arab support would help cement and produce a representative Palestinian leadership, will help provide security for Israel, and will help with the guarantees for both so that you can move forward and that model could be replicated in the West Bank. What do you think of that?
I think that October 7th is a demonstration of how that is not going to work. You had peace agreements with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Egypt, with Jordan, by the way. And October 7th still happened.
But at that time, you didn't have an agreement regarding the Palestinian issue. This time, at least in Gaza, you have something that could be...
Something that is not being realized.
Yes.
And I think we probably share a pessimism about, again, with, I think, as I mentioned, attention being diverted from Gaza, that I am very concerned that the current realities are going to become entrenched and become a new normal, which is extremely dangerous, both in terms of the appalling humanitarian situation, the lack of reconstruction, the yellow line that is bisecting Gaza, and Hamas's continued role there.
Could this change as an outcome of the war with Iran? I understand we're both operating in a very vague, and it changes every day, it depends what the tweet of the morning is. But assuming Iran comes out of this, weakened at least, could this affect the prospect of moving forward in Gaza positively? Or is this wishful thinking?
I tend to think that it's wishful thinking.
Are we switching roles now?
Okay, you are the lofty, hopeful diplomat. I am the realist. I think that it is possible. There's a leadership struggle going on within Hamas. And if you have a new leadership that is more oriented towards Turkey, to Qatar, to Egypt, rather than to Iran, maybe also to Saudi, but maybe there are some avenues to explore there. But I also think that Iran's support of Hamas has been diminishing over the past few years. I think of it more like the Houthis and Iran. There's a relationship there, but it's not that Iran says you do X, Y, and Z, and it's executed upon, per se. So, yes, is there a possibility for change? Maybe. And in this very bleak landscape, should we potentially seize on it? Maybe. But I am concerned that the more likely outcome is there's going to be an initial, and we're seeing it already, a inability to move forward on the already unsatisfactory ceasefire arrangements. And Hamas's view is that indeed Israel is not abiding by the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, and that it will founder on the issue of disarmament, which is what has happened in the past. In 2014, there was another Gaza conflict. The Palestinian Authority was going to go into Gaza, and it foundered on the issue of disarmament. And so I worry very much that reconstruction in Gaza, other movements forward to alleviate the humanitarian situation should not be used as a cudgel to enforce disarmament.
Yeah. Okay. One more quick question in this attempt to find pathways positive, and then we'll move to the more comfortable, grim context. On the Israeli side, can one of the byproducts of the side effects of this war and all the anxiety it brought on Israelis? If you talk to people in Israel, they would tell you how the Iranian missiles were timed in a way that deprived people from sleep because they have to run to shelters every 3-4 hours and so on, especially at night, and the toll that this has taken on the population and so on, the displacement from the rockets in the north. So can this be, and the ultimate failure, despite all the military prowess of the IDF, to bring the attacks to an end? Does this create or promote a realization that you need more than power to achieve security? Or does it feed the same sense of siege and that your only protection is the military?
I think it can go either way, and we were, full disclosure, just talking about this before we came in, looking at the news about the ceasefire with Iran, which I don't even know if it's holding because of the issue of Lebanon. Probably people in the audience would know better than us at this point. I do hope that it helps feed a realization in Israel that tactical military successes cannot solve the strategic challenges that they face. And I think there's a lot of criticism of the ceasefire in Israel right now. I think if you look at the landscape of the Middle East right now, notwithstanding Israel's military efforts over the past few years, Hamas is still in place in Gaza. Hezbollah is still in place in Lebanon. The Iranian regime is still in place in Tehran. Weakened,
and the Houthis are
bruised, and the Houthis are still in place in Yemen. For me, and I've argued this with many Israeli colleagues over the years.
And a prime minister. I saw you with the Israeli prime minister at one point.
Yes, I've met him a few times. I don't want to divulge our particular conversations, but my feeling is you cannot defeat Hamas or these other groups through military means alone. You need a political alternative. For me, one of the lessons of October 7th, and I would hope that there would be examination in Israeli society for this, is it's a searing indictment of their policy towards Gaza. It didn't work. But they're doubling down on it.
They're doubling down on it.
Yes.
Okay.
And right, as of now, and again, where can a partner and an ally come in? It's to engage on these very uncomfortable but very important issues. And For me, this is the strategic blind spot of this Israeli coalition in particular, but they had an opportunity to bring in the Palestinian Authority in a more meaningful way. And the Palestinian Authority, we can talk, if you want, about its many flaws, and they are many. But it is the only legally recognized and institutionally standing representative of Palestine. It is the only framework upon which to build a Palestinian state and have a partner, And instead, there has been a effort to really undermine the PA, notwithstanding its security cooperation with Israel. And I think it's a tremendous mistake. And frankly, many in the Israeli security services feel the same way. But that's a real lost opportunity. It's in the 20-point plan, bringing in the PA.
At one point.
Yes, at one point.
Eventually. Yes.
Eventually.
So if the ceasefire in Gaza or the situation in Gaza gets blocked over disarmament and other issues, and the Israeli government and coalition and politicians on the right double down on the military response as the response to strategic challenges, that means we continue down the same reality that we live in, and it gets aggravated with all the other, settlers' activities and so on and so forth. So if the conflict continues and deepens and gets worse, how does this affect the United States? We know how it affects the Israelis and Palestinians and the countries in the region. But how does it, my question is about the US. How, we have seen the Gaza war and what it did to the American, not just American campuses, but to the American political system, to the public life, and so on. So if this continues to happen, how do you see this affecting the Democratic Party, politics in America, the youth, attitudes towards Israel, American Jewish community, and so on?
You're not going to give me a long answer for this one?
No.
I think we see the changes happening already. There's some shifts that are going on that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. And there's a lot of shifts going on that are ricocheting in a lot of different directions. So it's difficult to predict how exactly those are going to manifest in terms of American policy. But there was a Pew poll that just came out yesterday, and please fact check me because I may have the exact numbers wrong, but it was that 60% of Americans now have a negative view of Israel. That was compared to, I think, 44% 2 years ago, and something like 30-something% the year before that. 84%, according to this poll, of Democrats, adult Democrats, Democrats have a negative view of Israel, and over 50% of Republicans. I think that these trends are probably going to be accelerated by the Iran war. I think that this will ultimately manifest upon our relationship with Israel. Probably vis-a-vis our security assistance relationship with Israel. And we're already seeing that play out in the U.S. Senate with these joint resolutions of disapproval that are coming up for arms sales to Israel. But maybe in other ways as we move forward, including that you might see I think there is a strain of thinking that is coming up both on the Republican and among Democrats as well about why is there this special relationship with Israel? Why do we have a special security relationship with Israel? We should treat Israel as we do our other partners, particularly given that Israel economically is akin to Western Europe. Why is it the recipient of almost $4 billion in U.S. security assistance a year? Well, I think that's going to be the most proximate impact of it. How it manifests in terms of, the most proximate manifestation of it will be some shifts in our security assistance relationship, is what I anticipate. And frankly, I think it's what Prime Minister Netanyahu anticipates as well. Because before the Iran war, he came out. He suggested a shift in the U.S. security relationship with Israel. I think he's just trying to get ahead of the curve.
Mm-hmm. So it's a good segue to my following question. A lot of the literature on peacemaking in the Middle East, a common refrain is to blame the U.S. policy. The U.S. was biased, the U.S. didn't put enough pressure on this side, that the U.S. didn't follow through on that, and so on and so forth. You've worked with 4 presidents, I think?
I've worked under 5. I've worked in the White Houses of 3.
Okay. And so my question to you is, what are your thoughts on the U.S. responsibility? And when I say responsibility, I mean it in the narrow sense. I don't mean the U.S. could have done more, or the U.S. could have done better, or the U.S. is biased or not biased. That's not the question. The question is, to what extent would you put a blame on the ultimate failure of peacemaking on the shoulders of the U.S. administrations?
I'm not in necessarily the blame game.
But we are.
But we are. I mean, and frankly, that's one of the things that can be very frustrating about dealing with Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking is there's always posturing for who's going to be blamed, right? Who takes the blame for this? Oh, it was the Palestinians. They refused to agree to X, Y, or Z. Oh, it was the Israelis. They announced a settlement expansion just when we were on the cusp of who knows what. Oh, it was the Americans. They didn't push hard enough. I'm sure there's more than enough blame to go around. What I hope is that future policymakers going forward learn some of the lessons of the past, one of which I would say is, and I get concerned by some of the language that can be very, very fuzzy about a way forward, a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. I don't know what that means in practice, right? There's many, many signed agreements that lay out in very clear detail a path forward. There's also very legitimate security concerns on both sides for their populations. I think that there needs to be a path forward that is not just focused on process, but focused on realistic steps to both ease the daily lives of Palestinians you mentioned in the West Bank, movement and access restrictions, and Gaza, the humanitarian catastrophe, provide security for Israelis, and there is a potential regional role there, but also that doesn't just have aspirational language, but lays out time-bound plans for the future to reach this goal, because it's not rocket science.
Okay, let me
ask, what do you think?
I stop thinking when you're around. I just ask you a question.
No. This is supposed to be a discussion.
Well, it is. But I'm asking about the American role. So you want what I think of the... So let me kind of rephrase this. Can the U.S. alone, say you have your ideal administration in the White House, can that administration push the Israeli players and the Palestinian players and the region towards a solution when they are clearly reluctant to do what it takes to get to a solution? Is my question clear? Like with the coalition government like the one you have in Israel, with the Palestinian political meltdown you have and the division and Hamas and all of that, can your ideal U.S. administration get the parties to conclude a peace agreement and implement it?
I don't know that they can get them to conclude a peace agreement, but you can, as going back to where we started, stop some of the really problematic things that are happening right now, build, again, and we could talk for hours about the issue of Palestinian reform, but I do think that it's without question that the PA needs some reform, that and needs legitimacy, and there are ways to move out on that that are not incumbent upon signing a peace agreement in the next few months. Mm-hmm. So that there are interim measures, again, which can be a loaded phrase when it comes to this conflict, but there are steps that can be taken that will help so that you can stabilize things and have a base to move forward towards whatever is deemed the best way forward. And again, I tend to think, as I look at the range of alternatives, 2 states is for me still, notwithstanding all of the many, many challenges, I don't think we're quite past midnight on its prospects. But ultimately, this is going to be something that it's not, you can't jam that down Israeli and Palestinian throats. And again, many Palestinians and Israelis, particularly young ones that I speak to, see a future that is one state. For Palestinians, it's shifting from a nationalist struggle to a civil rights struggle. And that may well be the focus of a new Palestinian leadership when it is renewed.
Speaking of that, many Palestinians also focus today on accountability. Mm-hmm. And many would tell you the way forward is accountability. It's not forget the political solution. We need accountability for accusations of genocide, for the apartheid, we need for human rights violations, for war crimes, whatever you call them, right? Now, as a diplomat, as somebody who's been involved in this, in the real world, how would you assess the chances of accountability in this conflict in the coming 5 to 10 years? On a scale from 0 to 10.
And I think part of it is, how do you define accountability? Like,
ICC.
Okay. That I don't know. I mean, I think, there's a whole case that is making its way through there. We will see. When I think also about accountability, I think about the West Bank. I think about the violence that is occurring there. Terrorism. Mm-hmm. There is Israeli terrorism on Palestinians. There is Palestinian terrorism on Israelis. The violence rates are, I was reading, I think this past year has been the single most violent year since the Second Intifada in the West Bank. And for Palestinians, there's a military court system, which has something like over a 95% conviction rate. And for Israelis, there is a civilian court system, which has something like a 98% acquittal. And that one statistic is indicative of one of the real challenges. I worry a lot with the lack of accountability at a very personal level, much less at a global level like you're referring to, that's a recipe for further violence and further instability and further rounds of this conflict. And accountability in a sense that there is your concerns are going to be addressed, the injustices that have been, be it violence or otherwise, that there is a way forward other than violence for it to be resolved is critical. So is accountability important? Yes.
Is it going to happen?
I don't know.
I have one more question before we open the floor for questions. And you worked for the Obama's White House, and many presidents started their term by saying, we want to stay out of the Middle East, it's not worth it.
Every president.
Right?
Every
and
president.
Then they end up all kind of at one point or another, leaving everything else and focusing on it. President Obama was, I think, the one who articulated the idea of disengagement from the Middle East in the most eloquent way, maybe just because he's the most eloquent president we had. But he spoke about it at length. There is this interview in the Atlantic, right, the Obama Doctrine.
It really upset a lot of people in the Middle East.
Yes, but that tells you how much he touched on. And his point is the United States should get out of there, minimize, not get out, but minimize and kind of calibrate its intervention because it has to focus elsewhere where things are happening. There's one point where he says, changes are happening in Asia. This is where the future is happening. We should not be distracted from it by the nihilist part of humanity. That's the Middle East. So my question to you is, why should any future president not follow through with this idea and just minimize, given that the U.S., for whatever reason, cannot make peace with the existing conditions, and it gets blamed by everybody. So what is the point? Why not scale down American role in that whole business?
Well, I would say if past is precedent, I mean, again, virtually every U.S. president that I've worked for has iterated a desire to pivot towards Asia in some way or the other that has not been realized, and we're seeing play out over the past few weeks, the most recent expression of that. You're also looking at the Middle East through the lens of Israel-Palestine,
yes.
and it's a much bigger and broader landscape with much broader U.S. interests at play. I would say when it comes to Israel-Palestine, President Biden, unlike every U.S. president before him, since certainly Clinton, if not before, didn't appoint an envoy for Israeli-Palestinian peace and to work on that. He tried to implement what you're saying.
What Obama said.
Which obviously did not quite play out. I think as he
it
expected.
ended up with Blinken going to the region 17
Yes.
times. The question is why? What keeps drawing the U.S. to this?
Well, again, it's much broader than Israel-Palestine, our interest in the Middle East. And one could argue that the genesis of those relationships there, a large part of it was the energy aspect. But that is metamorphosing, although still hugely important, as we've seen in the past few weeks. But the Gulf has pivoted, and there's a lot of very, very interesting things that are happening there that impact very, very much on U.S. interests, but also energy. And I would say, to paraphrase an American saying, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And there's impacts, not just security-wise for the United States and for our partners, but on our alliances and partnerships in the region. And I think that it is unlikely that the U.S. is going to absent itself in the way that perhaps some U.S. presidents have desired, because and to focus more on Asia, because issues in the region just keep reaching out and grabbing you by the throat and dragging you back in. And I think there's been a desire by many U.S. presidents to be the one who can somehow finally resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And there, frankly, are very, looking at Jimmy Carter's track record, right? And then Bill Clinton's with Jordan, but Jimmy Carter with Egypt. There's an incredible legacy of U.S. peacemaking in the region that also should not be forgotten, of successes. And I think that a more peaceful and stable Middle East is very, very much in U.S. interests. And so that fuels a logic to be engaged and to try and work towards resolving this conflict.
Right. Questions time. The floor is yours.
For both of us, feel free. As you heard, my colleague has an illustrious diplomatic career.
Yes, I was very struck by something each of you said. You were talking about your father and saying stopping the bleeding. And you were saying if really nothing changes, then the situation on the ground changes dramatically, right? Credibly, 80,000 dead in Gaza. That's 40,000 times the student body at Wellesley College. West Bank, I don't have the numbers, but the land alienation and expulsion is going on. So if the military option hasn't worked, the expulsion and the extermination might be the last kind of breath of that policy. And it may in the end not get rid of everyone, but one begins to then think comparatively about, without imposing terms on this audience, but one begins to think about the Armenians in Turkey. Turkey does not have an Armenian problem anymore. Right quotation marks for the problem. One thinks about South Africa in the sense of a very militarized government trying to suppress others, right? But there, of course, the population was like, well, when I started teaching, it was 20%. I think now it's 12% or 10% white. So a very completely different kind of demographic. Rwanda, Tutsi come back to power with a vengeance, right? So that is also something to consider. Yeah, and these are not, I do not mention these as kind of, causing trouble with those comparisons. They are not precise comparisons. But what is maybe relevant is if these policies continue and they begin to focus on expulsion, extermination, imprisonment, and all that, then how do you stop even the bleeding, right? That is what I was thinking about.
And I think expulsion is something that is obviously very much on the minds of some in the Israeli coalition right now on the extreme. And it's being heard in the region and by Palestinians with great alarm. And I spent the past 2 years in Jordan, where that is what people are focused on, is the West Bank. Why? Because Jordan is over 60% Palestinian. Why? Because they absorbed huge refugee waves in 1948 and 1967, which fundamentally changed the demographic makeup of the country. And they are very concerned about some of the activities in the West Bank that are happening at a very granular level of Palestinians being expelled from their land. Concerned about it from a sense of prospects on a humanitarian level, concerned about it in terms of prospects for a Palestinian state, and concerned about it in implications of potential refugee flows to Jordan. I think that the United States needs to be very, very clear, and there have been some clear statements, certainly when it comes, that there's been, also when it comes to Gaza, there's been some who have been talking about expulsion from Gaza, which I find very shocking. It is unquestionably a war crime, and I have been relieved to see the U.S. administration make some statements about no movement, no transfers of people from Gaza. There needs to be very, very close attention to that when it comes to both Gaza and the West Bank. I don't know if you want to chime in.
I am less concerned, less worried about massive, dramatic moves or developments along the lines you mentioned, then I am concerned about the slow erosion of people's lives. So you don't have to expel the population from Nablus, but if you spend your entire life unable to leave town to go to the next town to see your family or to tend to your business because you need a permit, and when you get the permit and then the permit is delayed or the permit is denied, and then you have a permit but then you're going to stop at the checkpoint and you spend 3 hours and then you get detained, and that becomes your life, and then your family, and somebody's arrested and somebody's tortured and all of that. If this becomes your life is being destroyed. If you live going into shelters and out of shelters and feeling that your neighbors want to kill you at the nearest possible opportunity, your life is getting wasted. This is the life of Israelis and Palestinians, and it has been for a very long time. And that, to me, seems to be where things are heading, and that is because it doesn't create headlines. It becomes, nobody pays attention to it in the same way. But this is the fabric of human life that is being destroyed. That's the worrying thing for me. Professor Oliver.
Thank you. So some Gulf states have expressed an interest in the United States and Israel continuing their assault on Iran because they view it as an opportunity to reshape the region. I'm wondering what you think the likelihood is of these Gulf states putting ground troops in Iran to finish the conflict, or is that just too far off in people's imagination? And if that were to happen, how that would reshape the region more broadly?
My view is that the Gulf states were not advising that this war should happen. They've now been impacted by it in very profound ways. The UAE has taken more incoming missiles and drones from Iran than Israel. There's also obviously been significant damage in Bahrain, in Kuwait, and Saudi, Qatar. I think what they worry about is U.S. attention span. And I have heard from some colleagues in the Gulf about their concerns about the U.S. left, in their view, Iraq and Afghanistan. And they are worried now that a war that they did not advise should happen leaves them with a angrier Iran, more empowered when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, an Iran that has demonstrated its ability to impact them and their economies in very profound ways, and that they will be left holding the bag because the U.S. attention span will be short. So when they're talking about finishing the job, I think they mean something different than Israel may mean when it comes to, quote, finishing the job, or the United States. I think when it comes to Israel, they're talking about regime change. I do not think, I certainly have not heard from any officials from the Gulf, number one, that they would advocate either for U.S. boots on the ground in Iran, or that they would put their own troops on the ground in Iran, or that they think that regime change is possible in terms of a profound shift in the regime through military means. But what they are talking about is finishing the job when it comes to Iran's drone and ballistic missile capability, so that Iran cannot threaten them, and ensuring that Iran does not have a toll system over the Strait of Hormuz. So I imagine yesterday there was a lot of commentary in the Gulf about the ceasefire arrangement and concerns about what this would mean for their future engagement with Iran and dynamics in the region. I think that there has been a very, very interesting security relationship between the United States and the Gulf and other Arab partners that, frankly, over the past 2 years of previous rounds of conflict with Iran resulted in essentially air defense of Israel. I think that model, if you look at what the spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar said a few weeks ago, is being questioned. So when it comes to a new security architecture for the region, I think there's, again, a few different models, and when people are talking about it from different capitals, they mean very, very different things. I think, I worry that we're going to see a lot more diversification among our Gulf partners of their security partnerships, rather than simply the very, very strong partnerships that we've had with them historically. I don't know whether you have additional thoughts on that.
I think it seems to me that because Iran has demonstrated this ability and willingness to inflict that kind of damage and more on Gulf states, it seems logical to me that they would be interested in finding a way to address that in the future, that what they lived with as a potential threat turned out to be real. And therefore, I see that this round of conflict could push Gulf states closer to to Israel and to the United States, which means that if the issues are not resolved with the Islamic Republic of Iran at the end of this, then we will be in for another round later down the road. But I like you, I haven't heard, and I can't envisage Gulf states troops going on the ground, nor do I think they would be very effective given fighting experience of both sides.
And I would just add a comment that the specter of war, of full-blown military conflict, has overhung our negotiations with Iran in the past. It's now happened, which means when you're at the negotiating table, it's not as potent a specter because it's happened, and from an Iranian perspective, they've withstood it. That's been one of, again, where you sit so impacts your view of things. And I've been concerned that in the administration, perhaps they're not fully appreciating that the Iranians don't feel defeated. They're not coming to the negotiating table prepared to make significant compromises, certainly not on their nuclear program. So the ceasefire, if already we're seeing some issues in terms of the Lebanon, I worry very much about, particularly when it comes to the highly enriched uranium, what the respective understandings are. I hope to be pleasantly surprised and that the negotiations will move forward smoothly, but there is a lot left to be resolved that is hugely challenging.
Jasser.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you in a different setup. In September 2023, Prime Minister Netanyahu was standing in the UN podium saying that the Palestinians are 2% of the Arab world and we can perhaps bypass them to reach a peace agreements with the Arab world and regardless the Palestinians. I have a inflicted vision, which is now after Gaza was left and after the West Bank is left for whatever you described as a life there. We have seen the gem of the Gulf states, which Dubai or Doha or Abu Dhabi, under attacks. And what if the Arab people or the Arab regimes or the Arab countries have connected their political vision or something with Gaza? I believe that the powerlessness of the Palestinians have allowed something like Iran or some country like Iran to exploit their cause and to use this cause as a leverage or as something, but ended up eventually with having Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi under attack. So I think everyone is talking about the diminishing of the American dominance in the Gulf or in the Middle East. What if the American administration has led something like this to include a new vision in the Middle East that includes everyone? I'm not very hopeful about the current administration, of course, for many reasons. But if there is any political imagination like this or something.
Thank you. I want to add a little bit to your question, and you tell me if I don't want to be hijacking your question, so if I understand it correctly or not. But what I hear you saying makes me think of the first Gulf War, the occupation of Iraq, the occupation of Kuwait, and subsequent liberation, George Bush, 92. Which then was a crucial moment in the missiles. So we have seen a scenario where we have a kind of a regional, and that there was an understanding back then that what you need to do is to find a way to solve many of those problems, and that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, finding a solution for it, would be key to addressing the other issues, to have a security structure for the region, to have regional cooperation, so on and so forth. So if I hear you correctly, the question becomes,
very much, yeah.
are we in a similar moment today, that we understand the Palestinian issue is not going to go away if we ignore it, and that everybody's security is at stake, and therefore, if even from a security perspective, we still need to find something broader, as you said earlier, to address that strategic challenge. And the something broader would have to include an Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution. Do you see this as a pathway forward? Not do you like, the question is not whether you like it. The question is, do you see it? Do you see any inkling in Washington suggesting that this would be something the administration would be interested in?
Very much. I mean, many people are saying that there is a moment like Madrid moment.
Look,
Except we will not go to Madrid. For
yes, not to Madrid. Could there be? Of course. And could it be attractive to President Trump, who I think, would, again, like to be the president who could find a resolution or create a broad-based solution like this? Yes. Do I think that that is likely to happen? No. In part because I'm looking at the implementation of the 20-point plan in Gaza as instructive, right? It's stalled. It should move forward. Is it perfect? No. Did it bring about a ceasefire to a terrible conflict? Yes. Is there opportunity in there? Yes. It's not moving forward. So that's not to say that there might not be, that there may well be leaders in the region who are advocating that this is a moment to be taken advantage of, and will find interested ears in Washington. But at this point, I'm not optimistic that will happen, but it could well be. And I heartily subscribe to the notion that it is all intertwined, that in order to reach this more stable and prosperous and peaceful region, we need a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Without it, both Israelis and Palestinians, but more broadly, the region and the United States will be pulled into different facets of this conflict for some time to come. It is the only way forward.
So I see students from Wellesley students here, and I have a question for their benefit. Because this is a women college, so the idea is that women feel less intimidated to ask questions. So I'm going to ask on their behalf. Because the question is, you have been a career diplomat your entire life, and you left the service at a political moment that's significant. A lot of the young people, males and females and all genders, are kind of torn about this issue. Should we join? Should we not join? If we join, would we be giving legitimacy to something we disagree with? To what extent? And so on. What are your thoughts on this? What do you tell them?
Thank you for asking this question. Anybody who's considering a career in international relations, let me strongly urge you to take the Foreign Service exam, go on USA.gov, jobs.gov, and check out what opportunities there are in various U.S. government agencies. It is a tremendous career working for the U.S. government. Again, I did as a U.S. diplomat, but there's a lot of different ways that you can. I will say I worked under the administration of 5 presidents. There's not a single president that I worked for that I agreed with every policy decision that they made. There's some that I disagreed with more strongly than others. But the ability to be part of the infrastructure of the government and have an impact in whatever small or large way on some of these big policies, or be the face of the United States overseas, is an incredible privilege and honor. And when I get together with my cohort that I graduated with as an undergrad and as a graduate student, there's a lot of people who have made a lot more money than I have. But I've loved my job, which is invaluable. And I've loved it even through very, very difficult times. And I struggled. I worked on Iraq in the lead up to the Iraq War, and then served in Baghdad, which is a seminal moment for me career-wise, because it was a very difficult moment for the United States in a policy decision that I was not enthused about. And it was still worth it to stay in and have an impact where I could on U.S. government policy. So if you're interested in a career in U.S. government, please look me up, and I'd be happy to speak with you in more detail. But I really, really encourage you to apply when you reach that point when you're a senior or beyond. It's a great, great privilege and a great career. And I will say it gives you an incredible perspective into decision-making in the U.S. government that you just do not have otherwise, and a platform, again, to impact those policymakers who are making the big calls and lay out the facts for them. And they'll make the choices, but you can help inform those choices.
On this note, thank you very much, Yael Lempert. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Professor. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming, and thank you, Wellesley, Liza, Oliver, for inviting us. And
thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of the day.